The USA, potentially the most powerful country in the world at the moment. Almost every other country looks up to the US, pales in comparison to them, and yet somehow we've crumbled as a society and approach an inevitable collapse. But how did we get here? Let's take a closer look at a similar scenario from many hundred years ago, the Great Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was founded in 27 to 31 BC, when Augustus Caesar declared himself the first emperor of Rome, and came to its end with the collapse and dissolution of the Constantinople in 1453 CE. The Roman Empire can be broken down into multiple time periods: the period of kings, which occurred and lasted from 625 to 510 BC, Republican Rome, which was from 510 to 31 BC, and finally Imperial Rome, which lasted from 31 BC to AD 476. But how did it all happen? How did the most powerful country of all time collapse in a matter of years? How did the most powerful economic structure ever lose its wealth and crumble into oblivion? This video will mainly focus on Imperial Rome and its rise to power and fall and its eventual collapse. Before we get into the main info, we need to get something out of the way. Rome was the most powerful country in civilization ever. They had the whole world's trade market in their control, and their military could run through near any powerful force. They were in a sense unstoppable. If they had advanced at the same pace as current cultures, there would be no question of who the most powerful was and is. Their militant forces used tactics that were unheard of, and many can't even be replicated to this day. Their unprecedented power and prowess of their armada was something for the ages, and allowed one of the biggest conquerings of a land in a single empire. They took control of the entire Eastern Hemisphere in less than 50 years. Rome could wipe out a civilization in a matter of weeks, even days. So how did this powerhouse of a civilization fall? What went wrong? Before we get into the finer details, let's take a closer look at the chronological timeline of Imperial Rome. After Caesar proclaimed himself the first emperor, the Roman Empire entered its territorial peak. From this time, there were 4 rulers that would serve after him: Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. The dynastic succession was interrupted when Nero died 68 years after Augustus was out of power. This death caused a civil war, which led to a new emperor taking power, Vespasian. He was part of the Flavian dynasty. This dynasty would be succeeded by the Antoines, which was a general family name given to the rulers Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, and Commodus. They held power in Rome from the years 96 to 193. After their reign, the accession of the Septimus Severus in 197 made him the first of the Imperial Severan dynasty to rule. The Severan dynasty would last from 197 to 235. He was later replaced by Caracalla, Macrinus, Elagabalus, and Alexander Severus. The absolute power of Rome, capital of the empire, was weakened over time. Between 235 and 300, Rome's only priority was to defend its borders from continuous attacks by the barbarians and the Sassanians from Persia. The pressure of these raids prompted the army to assume power in 235. This era is known as the military anarchy and lasted about 50 years. The emperors of this time had one sole purpose: fighting the empire's enemies and securing the borders. As a consequence of these constant wars, the army was very expensive to maintain, and thus the empire became crippled with debt. This in turn impoverished the population, and many lost their identity and values. Many put doubt in their religious beliefs, especially with the arrival of new doctrines from the east. In 284, a military revolt saved the empire, and Diocletian was proclaimed emperor. During his rule, he instaured a tiriarchy, a form of government that divided the power. Diocletian designated the general Maximian to take charge of the western regions of Europe, while the emperor governed over the eastern regions. Years later, he would appoint 2 Caesars. Diocletian abdicated in 305, revealing that his tetrarchic political system didn't work without someone to lead it. So, now that we know all of this information, what really went wrong? Well, in short, the government struggled as time went on, which led to the ever-expanding expenses of the military to be cut, and eventually, the military was sidelined for less pressing matters. The potentially fatal flaw of the Roman rule came with its government. To explain in more detail, you have to understand the different types of governments used by Imperial Rome. Originally, in the beginning, Rome was a functional kingship. One king had 100% or near 100% of the power. This form of government worked, and worked quite well, until the military began to expand. At this point, military leaders and generals required more representation in the government, and demanded it from the kings. Once the next dynasty began, these government bodies were formed, and it was turned into a monarchy. While this sounds quite similar, even the same, it is not in the case of Rome. They elected to have a council of powers who controlled separate parts of society. They ran it as such until the fall and rise of the next dynasty, which began to bring us to the main issue. They formed a republican form of government. A republic is the same form of government we have here in the US. A republic is a form of government where the people are sovereign from the government, and in turn are represented. It's similar to a form of democracy, but very different. If you want to learn more about the difference between them, click the card at the top of your screen to see our video on that topic. A republic is a form of government that allows people to have representation without having unchecked power. What happened is Rome allowed the people to have too much representation and control their power themselves. This led to the social restructuring of the government, and led them into democracy. At first, it remained a representative democracy. The people still had governors who would communicate their concerns to the council and leaders. This began to conclude the Republican period of Rome, and led to the downfall period in which they would finish their reign on European territory. Now, this is where things get quite interesting. Once they had entered democracy, a few key things changed in their society. People began to realize that Rome hadn't been a utopia as it had been portrayed by the government, and while much of the Great Roman expansion took place, people were an afterthought of power. Once this thought was embedded in their minds, there was no removing it. They began to propose more ideas to give people more power and ability to control society. At around 133 BC, the internal turmoil of the government caused civilizations to forfeit a standard traditional government system and opt for near full direct democracy. This brings up our next issue, the economy. With no governing body to reduce debt and command trade, the economic prowess of Rome dwindled, and they began to appear much weaker and more frail than they had in the past. Without their monopoly they once held on other territories, the trade market began to reopen and become more free, leaving Rome in the dust. The key mistake here was not keeping anyone in power. Even in democracy, you must still have representatives to control what matters most, and what other people cannot. And this is what the Romans didn't realize. They wanted 100% of the power, and for no one to be above them. This is not a possible solution, and the higher-ups in government must manage the country's foundation. The final most notable mistake they made was not establishing a line of succession. In their original empire, they had no true way of establishing the next ruler, which led to the country's highest-ranking generals ascending to power. This is not terrible and can be managed, if at some point someone is willing to establish a true government. Once democracy was in place, there was no one able to be there for the next legacy. The country reached its final frontier and was prepared to collapse. Now, you may be wondering, how does this relate to the US? Well, in terms of politics, we have almost the exact same arc of rulings and ideals. We both started out with a mother country, separate, establish dominance, have Republican representation, and in Rome, we see the transition to democracy, which is being pushed in the US today. These countries and their arcs of political epitome are quite similar, and although Rome went through more changes and failures, they are close in overarching structure. The US currently has a legislative and executive branch, which is an idea that was actually first cultivated in Rome. There may have been other civilizations that used a system like this, but none were as profound as the Romans. The political similarities don't end there either. Both countries were started and founded on the principle of manifest destiny, and the Romans believed God had created their opportunities so that they could conquer the entirety of the Eastern Hemisphere. They wanted to spread their beliefs and society throughout the world, and had their government not failed in its duties, they most likely would have succeeded. Not only are the arcs close in governmental structure, as far as military is concerned, both are the best in their field. The US currently has a military prowess unmatched in the rest of the world, and you can already begin to see the beginnings of the same collapse that happened in Rome. The government has begun the process of cutting funds of the military and lessening protection on our borders. This has caused the outside world to have a gateway into our society and truly weakens us as a civilization. The same issue did indeed arise for the Romans, as they had an influx of people from around the world flocking to assimilate to Roman culture. Rome had its sights set elsewhere, so they did not have the time or the care to deal with entering individuals from outside of their territories. The U.S. currently takes in around 1.2 million legal immigrants every year, and does not have any checked way of removing them, aside from deportation, which has seemed to be nearly called to a stop recently. In 1892, the U.S. assembled Ellis Island, a way for immigrants to legally assimilate to the U.S. From 1892 to 1924, Ellis Island proceeded to intake around 12.4 million immigrants who were processed and became U.S. citizens. In just the last 11 years alone, since 2010, the U.S. has intaken 42.8 million immigrants, almost half of which came illegally. This caused Rome the same exact problem we are having today. They could not afford the millions of people who were waltzed in and expected that the government could cover them. Our government is not built to take in a large number of immigrants, and neither was Rome. Cultures and civilizations are not meant to be merged and added to each other. They are meant to exist separately and be self-sustaining. Thinking that the world and our civilization can just combine into one big happy cesspool of cultures is a truly unrealistic goal. In fact, it's impossible. So, will history repeat itself? Will the tides of our Republican civilization come to a similar demise? Is it even a Republican civilization at this point? How did we get here? These are not simple questions, but this is not a simple world. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.